Prince Andrew is facing increasing pressure to move out of the Royal Lodge at Windsor, with representatives of King Charles reportedly in talks over the disgraced royal's home.
From Buckingham Palace, His Majesty the King has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles and honours of Prince Andrew.
The cameras were rolling, the footage exists, and what it captured in the cold Norfolk countryside may be the single most revealing moment in Prince Andrew's slow-motion fall from royal grace. A man who once walked the gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace with the absolute certainty of someone who belonged there, someone whose name alone commanded rooms to go quiet, was standing in front of a farmhouse. Not a palace, not a lodge, not even a manor. A farmhouse. And by every account from insiders who witnessed it, what happened next was deeply uncomfortable to watch. But here's the real question, and stay with me because this matters more than the headlines suggest. Is this farmhouse visit the end of Prince Andrew's story? Or is this just the opening act of an even more explosive chapter that the royal family desperately does not want you to see? Because what's happening right now inside the British monarchy isn't just about one disgraced prince being quietly relocated to a forgotten corner of an estate. It is about the entire institution scrambling, methodically, ruthlessly, and with extraordinary patience, to contain a narrative that keeps threatening to detonate. And Andrew, whether he accepts it or not, has become the living, breathing, footage-caught symbol of everything the palace is trying to bury. What you're about to hear is not just about a property dispute, it's about power, about identity, about what happens when an institution decides it no longer needs you, and you refuse to believe it. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you are going to see this farmhouse moment for what it truly is. Not a footnote, but a fault line. And it raises questions the royal family has absolutely no clean answers for. Who Andrew was, setting the stage. To understand just how seismic this farmhouse moment truly is, you have to understand who Prince Andrew used to be. Not the headline version, not the tabloid caricature, the real version. The version the palace spent decades carefully constructing, and then, when the crisis came, found impossible to protect. For well over 30 years, Prince Andrew was not some peripheral royal cousin turning up at garden parties twice a year to smile for photographers. He was a central, authoritative, fully operational figure at the very core of the British monarchy. He served in the Falklands War as a helicopter pilot, real military service in a real combat zone, and returned home as something of a national hero. He carried the title of His Royal Highness with full institutional backing and all the weight that entails. And he was, by the accounts of multiple royal biographers and palace insiders, the late Queen Elizabeth's favorite son. Not merely a beloved child, but the one she turned to, the one she confided in, the one whose presence brought her something the other children apparently could not. That closeness to the most powerful woman in Britain translated into real, tangible, institutional power. Andrew had access to rooms most people never even know exist in the royal machinery. He had proximity to decision-making that shaped policy, shaped public perception, shaped the monarchy's global reputation, and he had Royal Lodge. For those who may not know the full story of Royal Lodge, it is important to linger here for a moment, because this property is central to everything that follows. Royal Lodge is not simply a large house. It is a 30-room mansion, 30 rooms, situated within Windsor Great Park, the same vast, historic, symbolically loaded landscape that directly surrounds Windsor Castle itself. One of the oldest, most powerful, most recognizable royal residences in the world. Living within that geography wasn't just comfortable, it wasn't just prestigious. It was a daily, physical declaration to every courtier, every diplomat, every journalist, and every member of the public paying attention. Prince Andrew is still here. He is still inside the circle. Whatever you may have heard, whatever turbulence surrounds him, the institution has not cut him loose. Royal Lodge was his proof of relevance, his anchor, his daily argument to the world that despite everything, he still mattered. and the world he moved through was one of extraordinary reach and influence. He represented the crown on international trade missions. He attended diplomatic events on behalf of the monarchy. He cultivated personal and business relationships that spanned continents: Europe, the Gulf states, the corridors of global finance and politics. He was described by those who watched him operate as one of the most globally connected members of the entire royal family, a man whose address book alone was an instrument of soft power. So when people ask why the farmhouse visit hit so hard, when they question why this particular inspection trip reportedly left Andrew visibly shaken and emotionally destabilized, the answer is not complicated. The answer is context. The answer is contrast. The answer is understanding that what he was being shown on that quiet Norfolk property was not just a new address. It was a verdict delivered in bricks and mortar. Now you might be wondering, how does someone travel that distance? How does a prince who was once photographed alongside heads of state, who once walked into rooms and watched them rearrange around him, end up standing in front of a farmhouse that reportedly had pest control vehicles parked outside during its renovation? How does that journey happen? The answer is a name most of you already know, and it changed absolutely everything. The Epstein collapse. Let's talk about Jeffrey Epstein, because you cannot honestly tell the story of Prince Andrew's farmhouse or the Keys or Marsh Farm or any of it without going back to the precise moment the palace walls began cracking around him. The association between Prince Andrew and the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein was not a casual acquaintance or a chance social encounter that got misrepresented. It was a sustained, documented, multi-year connection involving repeated access to Epstein's social world.
The latest release of the Epstein files has laid bare the extraordinary influence that the American sex trafficker had on key figures in the British establishment.
A world that, as the investigations have made clear, was built around exploitation, abuse, and the protection afforded by extraordinary wealth and powerful connections. When Epstein's crimes first broke into public consciousness with his 2008 conviction, Andrew's name appeared in the periphery. Uncomfortable, but manageable. When Epstein was arrested again in 2019 and died in custody later that year, the peripheral became the center, and the center, it turned out, could not hold. The now infamous BBC Newsnight interview in November 2019 was Andrew's attempt to take control of the narrative. He sat down with Emily Maitlis in what the palace presumably calculated would be a composed, dignified rebuttal. It became something else entirely. It became one of the most scrutinized, most replayed, most analyzed royal media appearances in the history of the institution. Journalists, lawyers, communications professionals, and ordinary viewers around the world watched it and arrived at a remarkably consistent conclusion. This was not a man clearing his name. This was a man making things considerably worse. The responses he gave, the explanations he offered, the details he emphasized, the questions he seemed unable to answer in ways that satisfied, didn't just fail to reassure. They generated new questions, new headlines, new lines of inquiry. What was intended as a closing statement functioned instead as an opening of doors the palace had desperately been trying to keep shut. What happened next moved at a pace that stunned even veteran royal observers. Within days of the broadcast, Andrew announced he was stepping back from public duties.
Prince Andrew says he is now stepping down from his royal duties. Royal duties basically means he represents the Queen, charity events, public events.
The palace released a carefully worded statement, and then, quietly and methodically, the institutional dismantling began. His military titles, all of them, over 50 honorary roles tied to regiments, ceremonial positions, and the traditions of the British Armed Forces, were stripped. His royal patronages evaporated. The charities, organizations, and institutions that had carried his name distanced themselves almost immediately. Some before any formal announcement was made, sensing which way the wind was blowing. His HRH title, while technically retained in name as a courtesy, was rendered operationally meaningless. He was no longer a working royal. He was no longer anything with an institutional function. Pause and really sit with what that means for a man who had spent his entire adult life, every year of it, every achievement, every relationship, every door that ever opened to him, operating through the machinery of the monarchy. The title on the letter, the car with the flag, the aide who made the call, the deference that walked into the room before he did. Remove the monarchy's active endorsement from that life, and the question of what remains becomes genuinely, uncomfortably difficult to answer. The palace issued statements acknowledging serious errors in judgment and expressing empathy for victims connected to the broader Epstein scandal. Andrew has consistently and publicly denied any wrongdoing. That tension between institutional positioning and personal denial has never been resolved, and it remains live, because unresolved tensions in stories this powerful have a way of resurfacing when least expected. But here is what the transition from Royal Lodge to Marsh Farm actually represents when you strip away all the property management language and the estate logistics. It is the monarchy making the distance between itself and Andrew not just official, but permanent, tangible, visible, geographic, written into the landscape itself. And that, as anyone who truly understands how the British royal institution operates will tell you, is the most powerful statement the palace can make without ever opening its mouth. The farmhouse visit. What really happened? Now let's get into the footage. Let's get into what actually happened at Marsh Farm, because the detail of it matters, and most of the coverage has skimmed over the specifics in favor of the drama. Andrew reportedly arrived at the property expecting what on paper looked like a routine inspection visit. Marsh Farm sits nestled deep within the Sandringham estate in Norfolk, and the word nestled is doing a lot of work there, because what it really means in this context is hidden, out of sight, off the main routes. A property that had sat vacant for years and was now undergoing renovation, new security systems, refreshed interiors, upgraded amenities, in preparation to become Andrew's future residence. On paper, the project looked almost reasonable. A 5-bedroom farmhouse, yes, but one being fitted with modern comforts and enhanced security. Not a ruin, not a punishment cell. A renovated country property on a royal estate. Surely manageable, right? That is absolutely not what Andrew's face said when he got there. Multiple insider accounts, reported consistently across the Mirror, the Daily Mail, and Hello magazine, describe Andrew arriving and undergoing what one source specifically characterized as a noticeable shift the moment he stepped onto the grounds. He was visibly shaken, deeply frustrated, profoundly unhappy. One insider went further, using language suggesting his emotional response edged toward what they described as dangerously close to a complete loss of composure. Another account used the phrase fit of pique, which, even if somewhat exaggerated in translation, still tells you something critical about the emotional temperature of that visit. Now, let's be fair for a moment, because fairness actually strengthens the analysis here. Property inspections during renovation are stressful for anyone. Mid-construction properties are invariably dispiriting. They smell of plaster and damp. Rooms look smaller without furniture. The gap between the architectural drawings and the physical reality is always jarring. These are universal experiences. But ask yourself this: why would a man, a grown man, a former military officer, a prince who has navigated genuine international crises, have that kind of visceral, reportedly near-breakdown reaction to visiting a farmhouse renovation unless the farmhouse was representing something categorically larger than a farmhouse? The answer the sources consistently point toward is this: Andrew scrutinized everything: the room dimensions, the ceiling heights, the furniture placement plans, the ongoing construction work, the newly installed security systems, which notably were not there to reflect his continued importance, but to contain him, to keep the world out and him in. He walked through each space and noted every detail, and with every detail he noted, the gap between where he was standing and where he had come from widened into something that could no longer be ignored or minimized. The emerging details from the renovation process added another layer of uncomfortable symbolism. Reports of pest control vehicles arriving at the farmhouse during construction. Whispers of potential flooding vulnerabilities due to the surrounding rural landscape. These are, as has been noted, entirely common challenges for country properties. But their juxtaposition with the image of a prince who once occupied 30 rooms in Windsor Great Park renders the contrast almost theatrical in its cruelty. And there is something else happening here that has been underreported. Removal vehicles had reportedly already been observed outside Royal Lodge before this farmhouse visit even took place. Andrew reportedly knew, on some level had to know, that the timeline was locked in, that the deadline for vacating Royal Lodge was approaching, that there would be no last-minute reprieve, no negotiated extension, no royal accommodation that would allow him to stay. The farmhouse visit wasn't just an inspection. It was a confrontation with a decision that had already been made, without him, above him, and despite him. And one more detail that deserves its own moment of attention. Until the renovations at Marsh Farm are even complete, Andrew is reportedly being temporarily housed at Wood Farm Cottage, also on the Sandringham estate, a much smaller dwelling that was previously used by Prince Philip during his own retreat from public royal life in his final years. Prince Philip, a man who, at the end of his extraordinary life, voluntarily stepped back and disappeared into quiet country living. The symbolism of Andrew now occupying that same transitional space, whether intentional or not on the palace's part, is the kind of detail that royal historians will note with grim precision: the geography of power, why location changes everything. Here is something the mainstream property-focused coverage consistently underplays because it requires understanding how the monarchy actually functions from the inside. And most journalists covering this story are writing about real estate when they should be writing about power dynamics. In royal life, geography is not incidental. Geography is not background detail. Geography is everything. Where you live determines your proximity to power. Your proximity to power determines your visibility. Your visibility determines your relevance. And within the British royal institution, relevance is not simply social, it is political, ceremonial, and deeply structural. It determines what rooms you are invited into, what conversations you are included in, what events your presence is requested at, what the institution signals about you to the world simply by keeping you close. Royal Lodge sat within Windsor Great Park, and Windsor Great Park is not a nice neighborhood. It is the operational heartland of the British monarchy's physical geography. Windsor Castle, active, continuously used for ceremonial functions, state occasions, investitures, diplomatic receptions, is right there. Being in Windsor meant Andrew could, without planning or ceremony, be physically adjacent to whatever the monarchy was doing. He could appear at events. He could be seen at the right moments. He could maintain, even if only through proximity, the appearance of continued connection to the institution. That proximity was strategic. Andrew understood it as strategic. The palace understood it as strategic. And it was precisely because it was strategic that removing it was the single most decisive act in Andrew's marginalization. Marsh Farm offers none of that proximity, none of that visibility, none of that connection. Marsh Farm is located miles from the main Sandringham house, itself already a retreat estate rather than an operational royal center, and is tucked into the Norfolk countryside in a way that places it firmly outside any daily visibility that could sustain a sense of royal relevance. Sandringham is where the family goes to be private, to be away from official life, to rest. It is not where you go if you want to remain in the consciousness of the institution. Permanently relocating Andrew there, not as a holiday arrangement but as a fixed address, sends a message that requires no interpretation. You are being placed somewhere the monarchy does not have to look at you. Somewhere the cameras do not point by default. Somewhere far enough from London, from Windsor, from the machinery of royal public life, that your absence becomes the baseline and your presence somewhere else requires active explanation. Royal commentator Robert Jobson has suggested Andrew appears profoundly disinclined to accept this transition, and that is a diplomatic reading. The ground-level reports suggest something closer to active resistance. But the evidence on the ground makes clear the transition is happening regardless. Removal vehicles spotted, renovation timeline locked, deadline set and publicly known. Because this is how King Charles's slimmed-down monarchy operates when it needs to contain a problem without manufacturing another one. It does not make declarations. It does not hold press conferences. It reallocates geography. It reassigns addresses. It moves the person to a location that communicates everything, using not a single word. The Sarah Ferguson factor. Here is a thread that has been hovering at the edges of this story, mentioned in passing by most outlets and genuinely examined by almost none of them. And it deserves more than a passing mention, because it adds a layer to Andrew's current situation that makes the farmhouse transition even more disorienting than the property itself suggests. For years, nearly 3 decades in fact, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, continued to share Royal Lodge as a domestic base. Together, despite having officially divorced in 1996. Despite the separation being, by any conventional measure, ancient history. Despite the fact that by the time the Epstein scandal erupted, they had been divorced longer than many of their public supporters had been alive, and yet there they were, sharing a 30-room mansion in Windsor Great Park, walking their dogs on the same grounds, celebrating family occasions under the same roof, operating what multiple royal observers described as one of the monarchy's most peculiar and enduring domestic arrangements, a divorced couple maintaining not just cordial relations, but a genuine cooperative household, bound together by shared history, shared children, shared identity, and the shared geography of Royal Lodge itself. For Andrew, this arrangement was anchoring in ways that went beyond the merely practical. Sarah provided daily companionship in a life that, post-Epstein, was becoming increasingly isolated. She provided continuity with the version of his life that still felt like his own. She knew him before the catastrophe. She remembered him as he was. That kind of witness is irreplaceable, particularly for someone whose public identity had been so completely dismantled. Now that arrangement is reportedly shifting. As Andrew prepares to leave Royal Lodge, sources suggest the domestic dynamic that sustained both of them through over 2 decades of unconventional cohabitation may be entering its own period of transition. What that means concretely, whether Sarah follows, whether she establishes a separate base, whether the arrangement simply ends, remains unconfirmed. But the fact that it is in flux adds yet another destabilizing variable to a life already enduring extraordinary structural upheaval. And this matters to the larger story because it speaks to the totality of what Andrew is losing. Not just a house, not just a postcode, not just proximity to Windsor. He is losing the entire architecture of daily life that Royal Lodge represented. The physical space, the domestic relationship, the routine, the sense of normalcy that insulated him from the full force of his institutional collapse. Marsh Farm replaces all of that with a renovated 5-bedroom farmhouse in Norfolk, and what appears, from the outside, to be a profound and very deliberate solitude. The Bahrain question: could Andrew leave Britain entirely? Now here is where this story takes a turn that most coverage has treated as gossip and that deserves considerably more serious attention. There has been persistent, recurring international speculation, not just in royal gossip circles, but in outlets with genuine international intelligence on royal affairs, that Prince Andrew may eventually leave Britain altogether. And one destination keeps surfacing in those conversations with notable consistency: Bahrain. Andrew's connections to Bahrain are not superficial. They are long-standing, personal, and documented. His relationship with the Gulf states' ruling establishment dates back years and spans both social and business dimensions. He has visited. He has maintained ties. He has cultivated a relationship with a country that, in geopolitical terms, represents a very different set of rules about what happens to powerful men who have fallen from grace in Western institutions. Now, should that speculation become reality? Should Andrew genuinely relocate to Bahrain or another Gulf state on a permanent or semi-permanent basis? The implications are extraordinary, not just for Andrew, but for the monarchy's attempt to manage and contain his story. A British prince, born to the late Queen Elizabeth II, son of Prince Philip, uncle to the future king, departing the United Kingdom not for a holiday or a business trip, but as a practical exile. That is not a quiet ending. That is not the fade-to-countryside retirement narrative the palace appears to be scripting. That is a rupture, and ruptures at that level have consequences that ripple back into the institution, no matter how carefully the distance has been managed, which reframes the farmhouse entirely. If Bahrain is genuinely on the table, and sources suggest it is at minimum a live consideration, then Marsh Farm is not a destination. It is a waiting room, a transitional arrangement, a secluded corner of a royal estate where Andrew can reduce his public profile while larger decisions about his future, some of which may not be entirely within his own control, are resolved. And that raises the question that no one in the mainstream coverage seems willing to ask directly. Has the palace considered this possibility? And if so, is the Sandringham relocation designed not just to distance Andrew from the monarchy's operational center, but to position him somewhere quiet enough that if and when a departure happens, it generates the minimum possible turbulence? These are questions, not answers, but they are questions the footage from Marsh Farm makes impossible to dismiss. The bigger picture, what this means for the monarchy under Charles. Pull back now and look at the broader context, because what is happening to Andrew does not exist in isolation. It is part of a deliberate, carefully managed reconfiguration of what the British monarchy is, who it includes, and what it is willing to sacrifice in the name of institutional survival. Under King Charles III, the direction has been explicit and repeatedly stated: a slimmed-down monarchy, fewer working royals, tighter management of who carries the institution's public face, less room for peripheral figures who consume attention, generate controversy, and provide no corresponding institutional value. The logic is entirely sound from a survival perspective. A monarchy that appears bloated, expensive, and entangled in reputational crises it cannot control is a monarchy that finds it increasingly difficult to justify its existence in a modern democratic society that is already asking hard questions about the cost of the crown. Andrew, in this context, is not simply a problem. He is the defining test case for the new model. He is what happens when the slimmed-down agenda meets a figure who was born into the inner circle, who never prepared for life outside it, and who is, by every account, unwilling to accept his removal from it. The surgical precision of Andrew's marginalization over the past several years is worth documenting in full, because it illustrates exactly how the palace manages these situations when it wants to achieve a result without creating the headlines that a direct confrontation would generate. Title by title, patronage by patronage, role by role. Each step individually small enough to be processed as routine administrative adjustment. Each step, viewed in sequence, constituting what amounts to a comprehensive, irreversible institutional exile, executed without a single press conference, without a single formal announcement of intent, without ever once saying the word exile. This is institutional genius, if you can call it that. And it is also, from Andrew's perspective, something closer to gaslighting on a royal scale. Because at no point was there a moment where someone sat him down and said, "This is what we are doing, and this is where it ends." There was no verdict delivered in a room. There was only a succession of small decisions, each deniable in isolation, which together described a future he was never formally consulted about. And now the geography makes it permanent. Move a man far enough away from power for long enough, and eventually his absence from the story becomes the story. The cameras stop pointing at the farmhouse. The public moves on to the next chapter. Andrew becomes a footnote in someone else's narrative. That is the plan. The question, the one the footage raises with uncomfortable force, is whether Andrew is going to let that plan succeed. The resistance, why Andrew won't go quietly. Because here is what the farmhouse footage actually shows, if you look past the property inspection framing and see the human reality underneath it. It does not show a man making peace. It does not show a man finding grace in diminishment. It does not show a man who has done the internal work of acceptance and arrived at something resembling serenity. It shows a man in active, visible, reportedly barely contained conflict with the situation he is being placed in. And that conflict has implications. Think about what Andrew's track record tells us about how he responds to crisis. When the Epstein scandal became unmanageable, his instinct was not to go quiet. His instinct was to go on television and argue his case, which produced one of the most catastrophic royal media appearances in living memory and accelerated exactly the outcome he was trying to prevent. The impulse was not wrong in human terms. It was entirely understandable. But the execution was disastrous, and the lesson, apparently, has not been definitively learned. Because Andrew has not disappeared. He continues to make public appearances. He continues to speak through intermediaries and to maintain relationships with journalists and commentators who are sympathetic to him. He continues to contest, through whatever channels remain available to him, the narrative being constructed around his name. He has not formally accepted any of the institutional verdicts that have been delivered. He has not given a public interview in which he says, "I understand. I accept. I am done." He has not written the closing statement the palace would clearly prefer him to write, which means the possibility of a countermove remains real and should be taken seriously. A new interview with a different interviewer and a different approach. A documentary with sufficient editorial control to present his version of the story. A book. A legal challenge that resurfaces publicly. A revelation from within the Epstein case proceedings that puts his name back in the headlines in a context the palace cannot manage. Any of these scenarios, and there are others, would reopen the story at exactly the moment the palace believes it is finally, carefully, geographically closing it. And a man standing at a farmhouse in a state of visible emotional distress is not a man who has ruled those scenarios out. History tells us this. The people who go most quietly in royal drama are the ones who made that choice actively, with full agency, from a place of genuine understanding. Andrew, by every indication, is not that person. And that makes the farmhouse visit not the end of anything, but the pressure point where everything unresolved in this story becomes most visible. The symbolism of the keys. There is one image in this entire story that deserves its own moment. One act that, if and when it occurs, will function as the single most concentrated symbol of everything this years-long transformation represents. The keys. Reports indicate that when Andrew vacates Royal Lodge, and the timeline is now set, the deadline is approaching, the removal vehicles have been seen. The keys will be formally returned to the Crown estate, not passed on to a family member, not retained by a household staff member for future access. Returned to the Crown, to the institution itself. In administrative terms, this is a formality, a procedural step in the handover of a property between a royal resident and the estate management that technically owns it. Nothing more. In symbolic terms, it is the closing of a chapter so complete, so final, so deliberately choreographed in its significance that it borders on the ceremonial. There is something almost medieval about it, the literal physical act of returning keys to the crown, of acknowledging, in the most tangible possible way, that whatever authority you believed you held over that space was always conditional, was always, at its core, borrowed. was never, despite 3 decades of residence and all the identity constructed around it, truly yours. A figure who once embodied royal continuity, who carried the weight of that institution's history and symbolism in his very name and title and address, standing at the entrance of Royal Lodge and handing back the keys. That moment, when it comes, will be photographed. It will be circulated. It will be discussed in royal circles and media coverage and comment sections for a very long time. And it will mean something far beyond its immediate practical reality. Because those keys represent the last physical evidence of the Prince Andrew, who once moved through those corridors with absolute confidence. The man who believed, at least until that farmhouse visit made it impossible to continue believing, that some version of the old life could be preserved. That some accommodation, some negotiation, some royal grace would be extended that would allow him to stay adjacent to the world that formed him. The keys say otherwise, unambiguously. Finally, the keys say, "This is over." Conclusion. The story isn't over. Here is where we land, and it is not where you might expect. The British monarchy has spent the last several years constructing a narrative around Prince Andrew that moves in one direction: diminishment, distancing, and ultimately, irrelevance. Marsh Farm is the latest and most geographically concrete chapter in that narrative. The footage of his visit there, a prince in distress, confronting the full weight of what his life has become, is the most honest image the public has seen of where this process has brought him. But here's the truth that gets lost in the coverage of royal property and real estate logistics. Stories this charged, involving a figure this complex, within an institution this opaque, rarely end the way they appear to be ending. The monarchy believes it is closing a chapter. Andrew, by all accounts, does not believe the same thing. The footage captured at Marsh Farm is not of a man making peace with a quieter life. It is of a man in conflict with the story being written around him. And men in conflict with the stories written around them have a history, in royal circles and beyond, of doing unexpected things. Will Andrew accept life on the fringes and disappear quietly into the Norfolk countryside? Will the Bahrain speculation materialize into something real? Will there be a new interview, a new legal development, a new document that resurfaces and reignites everything the palace has worked so hard to contain? Nobody outside a very small circle knows the answers to those questions. But the farmhouse footage tells us this much. The man standing in front of that modest property in the Norfolk countryside has not accepted the verdict. And a verdict that is not accepted is not, in any meaningful sense, final. The monarchy may believe this is over. Prince Andrew, visibly, emotionally, unmistakably, does not. And in royal history, the gap between those two positions has always been where the most explosive chapters are written. If you found this breakdown valuable, if this gave you context you didn't have before, leave a comment below with your honest take. Do you think Andrew will eventually accept life at Marsh Farm? Or is there another chapter coming that none of us are ready for? Because the comment section on this one is going to be worth reading. And if you want to stay ahead of the royal stories the mainstream media buries in logistics, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this story is not finished, not by a long way.